Today I'm chatting with Peter Stockwell. He's professor of literary linguistics at the University of Nottingham and author of the book Cognitive Poetics. Peter, this book has been so helpful to me, and it's such a privilege to be talking with you. I'm really looking forward to our conversation here today. So welcome. And I want to ask you to start with to tell us a bit about your teaching and your research.
Sure. Well, thank you for saying that. I've always worked in a English department, a broad-based English department, where the centre of gravity would be the study of English literature. Though in the usual sort of divide, I would be sitting in the linguistics part of that department. But I see myself very much as a stylistician, as someone who crosses the divide between knowing about language and linguistics and being interested in literature and literary reading. So I'm interested in literature, and essentially I still see myself as a literary critic, but I'm just one that uses our knowledge of linguistics to be able to talk about well, literary works from pretty much all periods of English literature, and different cultures as well. So I don't feel myself pinned in on any little particular piece of literary context, I suppose.
Yeah. So your entry into cognitive linguistics, then, did that come through linguistics or
Well, I was doing an English degree and a language and literature degree, and this is in the 1980s, and in those days, English language essentially meant Old English and Middle English, and a little bit of linguistics, but of the sort of discoursey type. So we'd talk about, introduction to various aspects of rank structure and syntax, but primarily sociolinguistics and discourse analysis. So I wouldn't say that I came from a hardcore linguistics background. I've always been interested in language and literature in that sort of softer sense, I suppose. But yeah, so my PhD, I suppose, was in metaphor. And I was actually looking at examples of science fiction because they gave a good opportunity for talking about detailed textual metaphor, but also obviously the entire science fiction alternative world is a sort of metaphor as well. So it's like a discourse metaphor as well as individual examples. And I suppose this was the end of the 1980s, early 90s. And I was doing what I now realize was a cognitive linguistic application to literary reading, but we didn't call it that then. It didn't really have a name. So it was I stumbled across that accidentally. Whereas now, if someone was studying metaphor in literature from a linguistic perspective, they would, I think, straightforwardly be doing cognitive poetics.
So I think of cognitive linguistics as emerging, say, in the 1970s or so, so maybe about a decade before you started your PhD, right?
Yeah,
And
that's right. Yeah.
who were your conversation partners at that time? If you weren't calling it cognitive linguistics or thinking about metaphor theory in those terms, how did you know to do what you did at that point?
That's really interesting, actually, because I was talking about this the other day and to some of my students, and trying to get across to them the idea that the internet didn't really exist. So we were much more isolated in those days, even into the early 90s, than is typical now. So in fact, there was a very sort of European British tradition centered, I suppose, around stylistics, around using language to talk about literary texts. And then separately in North America, emerging actually out of linguistics departments, not out of English literature departments, an interest in talking about things like metaphor or blending or things that were drawn from cognitive linguistics, schematic knowledge when talking about literature. But we had no idea that they were doing it. In those days, if you wanted to search a university library in North America, you cranked up your dial-up and then sent a request to their server, and then you went and had a cup of tea and possibly lunch, and then came back. And when you came back, what you got was a screen full of their holdings, which you then had to send for on interlibrary loan. And a week later or 2 weeks later, you would get an article through the mail. So there was a real sense that there was sort of two parallel traditions developing in slightly different ways, actually. And what was really interesting was when we started meeting each other at conferences, largely, physically, through the 90s. And then as the internet took off and we were able to talk to each other more, we realized that actually there were people all over the world interested in similar questions. and trying to find similar solutions to them, but we'd all started from slightly different places. It was actually really interesting.
Yeah, that is. And so would you say that it was that kind of coming together when you kind of found your people, that you kind of realized what you were doing methodologically in terms of locating it?
Yeah, I mean, I remember very distinctly there was a conference in the middle of the 90s in some obscure place in Hungary, and I can't even remember where it was. It was hours on a bus from Budapest.
Wow.
And the conference itself, it was one of those big, huge MLA, SE type conferences that was too big, you know, where you don't really get to see anybody at all, and everybody comes and does their slot, and it's really a series of lots of little conferences. And after a day and a half of this, quite a few of us who were sort of a like mind got really fed up with it and thought, you know, there's a really nice little restaurant cafe in the woods on the end of the tram line. Why don't we just go there and have our own conference? So we essentially just decamped, talking about maybe 30 or 40 people, and had our own conference at this little wooden restaurant in the middle of the woods in the middle of Europe. And there were Americans there and Brits and people from the rest of Europe, one or two Japanese colleagues. And it was really the first time that I got a sense of how rich, well, I was going to say how rich the field was, but I think it was the first time I realized there was a field, you know, that it wasn't just somebody in a sort of introductory, interdisciplinary way trying to use, well, cognitive linguistics and cognitive psychology to talk about literature, that actually there was already a set of people doing what we didn't even really call cognitive poetics at that point. It was just sort of a cognitive approach to literature, I suppose.
That's fascinating. It makes me realize how much we take for granted the internet and being able to do these kinds of searches.
Oh yeah, absolutely transformative. You know, not just in the speed of things as well. You know, so ideas that started off. Well, thinking of take a seminal text like Lakoff and Johnson's Metaphors We Live By, 1980, or Lakoff's Women, Fire and Dangerous Things About Human Categorization, which I'm guessing now, 1987, I think. Now, I remember reading that in a reading group as a postgrad student in Liverpool at the end of the 80s, a year or two after it had come out. But the impact of those things didn't really start to be seen. I mean, I didn't see people using those things at conferences and in symposia till 5 or 6 years later. Now, that's inconceivable now, isn't it? You know, someone would come out actually as a preprint before the journal even appears, and then somebody will have applied it somewhere or taken it up or argued with it or developed it, you know, within weeks, within months. So everything just happens a lot faster now, I think. And there's some downsides to that, because I think you get a sort of convergence of thinking, which in some ways has stopped the innovation, you know.
I think that's right. And maybe, you know, instead of kind of taking the time to really think and test ideas, just, you know, putting things out so quickly, that can sometimes be detrimental.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's also a product of, you know, the sort of, I guess, the scientification of arts and humanities research, where putting out quantity of papers is now regarded as valuable and, you know, promotion worthy and is a good thing, rather than, you know, putting out fewer but better papers.
That's right. That wasn't even the case. I finished my PhD in 2010, and I think I had one publication, and now that's just unheard of to you got to have more than that to get in humanities, to get any kind of job. So
yeah. But it did mean that, you know, through the 90s especially, I'm sounding like a real old fuddy-duddy here. Through the 90s, it was certainly possible to come across really sort of crazy, off the wall stuff, or things that you thought were nuts, and then actually think, wow, wait a minute, this is just a different way of thinking about things.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's sort of harder now. There's more of a consensus. It's possibly just what happens to a field when a field becomes a field.
Sure.
You know, it's less of sort of the Wild West, I think.